Well, I'm really pleased to be at the Napo annual conference, and I'm really pleased that you've got it in Newcastle at last. I was the elected Labour Police and Crime Commissioner here until 2019, and in that role, I came to your conference in London. No, you do certainly get about. So, unlike then, I am now the Victims Commissioner for England and Wales, and consequently, I must, for obvious reasons of public confidence, be studiedly politically neutral. However, that isn't the only thing that's changed since 2013. Probation was struggling when I saw you in London, though, with the advent of transforming rehabilitation. Many of you were just being handed over into the alien commercial world of Serco and G4S. Do you remember it? Does it still give you nightmares? One of them had been fined for tagging people to protect the nation against their criminality, even though they were dead. And another had apparently overcharged the public by tens of millions of pounds, but was still on the bona fide contractor list for the government. This union, amongst many voices, told the previous government that your work had more than a commercial value. But on it went at a cost of well over 3 billion, and even more importantly, at a cost of the loss of thousands of highly skilled probation service people who had been doing the job, frankly, remarkably well. Now reversed, the service reunited, renationalised. I hope you're feeling buoyant and valued because you have proved to the deliberate non-believers that your skill, commitment and experience is of value to our community way beyond the price for which they wanted to sell you to the private sector. Let me say from the bottom of my heart, welcome back to the public sector. So you're the probation service helping offenders. I'm the Victims Commissioner dealing with victims. What on earth have we got to say to each other? Now, my role, set up in the Domestic Violence, Crime and Victims Bill, gives me three duties: to promote the interests of victims and witnesses, drive best practice for them, and keep the Victims Code under review. I managed to escape the office today without a PowerPoint, but if I had one to describe my role, the next section, which would have been about my powers, would have been completely empty because I don't have any powers. So how do we try to make a difference? We have a wide range of victims organisations and victims as our stakeholders, and it isn't what Vera Baird says victims want that matters, it's what they tell us that matters. And then I lobby with the other half of our stakeholders, are the folk who can deliver what victims need, ranging from the health sector to ministers, government, the judiciary, police, agencies like the CPS, and the probation service. And we do, the second way we work, research about the victim's position, publish them, our reports with as much gusto as we can, try to drive implication of them. We did a recent one about special measures in court, which are very partially effective, though very, very good if they're done properly. And we've just done one about victims of fraud, which is a very wide-ranging offence, and we need to identify different cohorts of people to try and work out how to tailor support for them to cope as victims and to recover. Cope and recover are the watchwords for dealing with victims of crime. So, firstly, let me set out my position about victims and offenders. A person may be a victim of crime one day and an offender the next. An offender one day and a victim the next. For example, a victim of domestic abuse may be a victim of coercive control and compelled into crime as if she were a victim of modern slavery. 60% of women in custody at any given time have had worse things done to them than they are in custody for doing to the state. Male and female victims of sexual abuse sometimes descend into chaos through their suffering and their trauma, and sometimes they offend. There is the same overlap of roles for young people too. We did a report called Sowing the Seeds about the impact on children of domestic abuse in their home. And in particular, we found that boys can easily start to look for an alternative family, often finding an undesirable one out on the streets, and then be unable to escape from the county lines that they get pulled into, or become exploited for sexual purposes. So victim, offender, offender, victim, you and I are not at war. This is not a war for the ascendance of rights from one side or the other. We are talking, in effect, about the same people. For this reason, though I'm Victims Commissioner, I sit on the advisory panel for female offenders, and I strongly support the pilot of pre-sentence reports that are going on for young people, for BME people, for women. And I'm shocked because the Prison Reform Trust tells me that it has been possible during this period we've just ended that a woman can go to court and be sentenced without the bench even knowing that she has children, never mind that she's a victim of domestic abuse. And you can't talk about domestic abuse in that open, immediate way to a lawyer. Of course, you need skilled probation officers to talk to offenders, to get out the truth of what underpins what they are doing. I have to say, it strikes me as absurd that you have to pilot pre-sentence reports to see if they're any good. They're an obvious need. Nothing that I say detracts about victims, detracts from the centrality of fair trial rights. I want to make that utterly clear as well. We should draw a red circle around defendants' rights and keep them safe. Yet we can improve the lot of victims and witnesses hugely and never come near to the edge of the circle. There are two kinds of justice to deliver by the criminal justice system, and both can be accommodated. Nobody in the position of a victim of crime is going to be wrongly imprisoned. That's why we red circle the defendant. But victims can and do suffer injustice from their treatment by the criminal justice system. Disregard by the agencies, re-traumatization by the process itself. I see victims as compulsory participants involved in the crime that's being committed against them, compelled into the criminal justice system, tied into a criminal justice case, witness or not, which may affect them forever. People go into that, probably their first entry into public affairs, afraid, confused, very affected by how they're treated in connection with what for them may have been a life-changing effect, a sexual trauma, the loss of their savings to fraud, or the loss of a child in a road crash. The court needs to acknowledge that people in that position who we failed to protect from crime in the first place as a nation need to be restored. They are demeaned somewhere on a conduit from demeaning to being totally traumatized and unlikely to recover. Victims all suffer from being victims of crime, and they need to know that the state cares, that the state wants to give them information, it wants to help them, it wants to give them support, it wants to treat them as a central figure. The real problem is that the criminal justice system, with its proper focus on defendants, I'm prosecuting him, I'm defending him, this judge is making sure he has a fair trial, this jury decides if he's guilty or not. The victim becomes fodder for that process, and everybody is nice if they possibly can be, but it's the one you can be less nice about because, number one, it isn't your job. You're the police looking at him, the prosecution looking at him, the court looking at him, and also, frankly, there's no penalty if you get it wrong in the way that there is a penalty if you get the rights of the defendant wrong. So there is a job to do to make sure that victims are treated well, and they simply want that. It's not about attacking defendants, it's about being restored to the kind of acknowledgement that they've suffered, but they are a full citizen about who the country is concerned. We've done research about this. The picture has been exactly the same for the last 20 years. This is what victims want. It is so easy and so straightforward to deliver that. There is a victims code now. We've had one since 2006, much more ignored than observed. The rights aren't even set out as rights. So for instance, a very important one is the right to have a separate entrance into court as a victim and stay in a waiting room separate from the defendant. People are very afraid of bumping into the defendant and or family supporters of the defendant. So that's your right. But the right then goes on that many courts don't have separate waiting rooms and they don't have separate entrances. So the court will then do its best. So they'll do its best if they can. This is what I mean. People are nice and they'll do it if they can, but it's not their central role. If this was a right, they'd have to build a flipping entrance for the victim to come in. So we have a real case to fight to make sure that we treat victims with real justice. And let me just say, it's not about sentencing either. There is abundant research, and there's one particular sentence that sums up this, jumping on the populist bus that ministers do all the time, saying we're putting victims at the heart of the criminal justice system by extending sentences. A book called Until We Reckon by Daniel Sered just says this: there is no evidence whatsoever that connects the length of a defendant's sentence to the well-being of a victim of crime. None. Of course, we have the Daily Telegraph, and people sometimes want longer sentences, but they vary like you and me, but there's no link between that and their recovery, and their recovery is what matters. So I think we have, an interest in people, often the same people. Very directly, we can work together on the victim contact scheme, which applicable to victims of violent or sexual crime where there is a sentence of 12 months or more. It deals with real significant victims. In my view, the victim contact scheme run by the probation service is crucial for victims. Since you, the probation service, have had the duty at the end of trial of informing victims about the victim contact scheme, instead of the witness care units doing it as they did, the numbers engaging in it have shot up. And if a victim doesn't respond to your initial invitation, the letter now allows them to be approached again, for instance, when parole is coming into place. Trade unionists all, I was worried that we'd create a demand by getting you to do these introductions that we couldn't meet because there was no money for the victim contact scheme to be boosted last year, but I'm told there is now. Some share of the 155 million newly available for probation will be earmarked. The service is recruiting for victim liaison officers. And I saw some management last week. I liaise with them quite often. And I said to them, hey, you've got some good news for these people I'm seeing in Newcastle somewhere? And they did say that there is a management tool which is being extended to victim liaison officers so that they can measure their caseloads, because, one case may be about this wretched police officer, an enormously sensitive case. Another case may be quite small. So they are going to get a management tool in play that helps to measure the impact of the caseload, not just its quantity. It's hugely important to look after the well-being of people who deal with victims in this way, because it's ever so easy to get secondary trauma. But what is the position is that everybody who's suffered, the death of a child or whatever it is through a criminal is going to have to confront the fact that that person will come out of custody at some time, and information and keeping them up to date, if they want to be kept up to date, can just help with that being achieved. Annual letters, annual contact, which just say something that means something. Why is he still Cat A and not Cat B? How is it that a decision is made to drop him to Cat B? Writing a letter carefully structured to indicate what's happening can help. I don't guarantee it, but it can help some victims to be better able to cope if they appreciate there is a process carrying on that might change this person, and that it is a process, and the end product is that he will be out again. So that role is massively important, just as important as I've set out it is to treat victims very well at trial. It is very important to try and inform them well about all of this. I suspect, though I don't know, that the role of a victim liaison officer may be something of a sideline, because it isn't your main work. Of course, it's imperative that it's recognised for the importance it has. Says me, Victims Commissioner, I would, but it is right. And it requires teamwork, since of course the Victim Liaison Officer can only pass on what the offender manager passes on to them. So I think it is a hugely important role. And as the Victims Code upgrades into the Victims Law guidance, which it will be, and the Victims Law comes into play, the statutory responsibility and the role of the VLO will increase, and I hope can become sought after. And I would say that if it's possible, if people who are dealing with offenders can nonetheless do a section of work as a victim liaison officer, you will know what I mean. So one thing that worries me is the proposed changes to the parole hearings, and I don't know what you think about those, but at the moment, the government thinks it should increase the transparency of parole hearings, perhaps making the board into a tribunal and piloting having victims who want to attend the whole hearing, either physically or I think online. This is going to massively extend the VLO role. So if victims are going to be witnesses to the full hearing, they are going to need a great deal more help than just a victim personal statement, which is nonetheless important, which they can deliver and VLOs help with. The VLOs are likely to end up as gateways to victim support services because we will re-traumatize victims if we are not careful. Where victims opt to attend and observe hearings, listening to the offender's case is likely to be quite re-traumatizing. The focus, of course, totally, as in the trial, but worse, on how good he has done, how he's improved, what improvements he's made, maybe mitigations or even denials of some of the facts of the case. The victim's family will have to sit through that. Even if it's true, it'll be hard to hear. They can't cross-examine. They must put up with the defendant's well-being at the forefront, watching the board lap up what they think are exculpatory or wrong issues. And I'm just very, very worried about it. And I'm very worried about offender managers who will rightly deliver positive material about the defendant, finding it more professionally difficult under the keen scrutiny of, severely injured victims' eye. What good will it do victims to be invited by the state to a hearing in the interests of transparency when they will hear just positive material about them and absolutely nothing about their suffering, except the victim personal statement, which they could read and just go, as they do now, and subsequently get a summary of what follows from you. For me, this is a harmful idea based on a vacuous ideology of transparency for sake of using the word. In reality, it runs the risk of re-traumatizing victims, hugely increasing the burden on VLOs and possibly impeding the force of probation orders' right arguments given in the interests of clients they represent. I think we should work together for our own people to oppose this. So my role as the Victims Commissioner is to be a voice for victims, and my vision to secure their place as an acknowledged participant so they get the rights and the recovery to which they're entitled. You work to rehabilitate defendants, some of whom have been through the process my victims have gone through. There is nothing between us. We can work together. We must take care not of the rules and regs of the CJS, but for me and for you, the people who are in it. The new Secretary of State for Justice may hold, I know not what, for us both. I'm sponsored by the Ministry of Justice. I'm also interested in a range of other ministers. Let me tell you one I met last week who's a charming person. She is a new Violence Against Women and Girls Minister in the Home Office. Somewhat mysteriously, she's come in from the Department of Transport. Nonetheless, violence against women and girls in transport, she strikes me as the only woman in the world who, when a policeman tries to arrest her and she's worried, could actually get a bus to stop and help her. I look forward to continuing to work with you, and let's see how we can work together to ensure that this currently, frankly, fairly appalling justice system treats with better humanity the people of all kinds that it's intended to serve. Thank you for inviting me here.